So we have been talking about personality and how psychodynamic perspectives help explain personality. So we've looked at Freud's psychoanalytic theory. We've looked at Jung's analytical psychology. One thing that we sort of didn't mention about Jung's analytical psychology is that Jung was the first person to draw out this distinction between introverts and extroverts. So he wrote about how introverts are people who are more occupied with their inner world. Or a world of, their own individuality, of their own thoughts and feelings, right? Whereas extroverts are individuals who are more interested in the outside world, right? With, for example, other people, with other objects, with things in their environment, right? So that's one distinction that Jung laid out, and that has sort of carried over into even the 5-factor model that we were talking about, which also incorporates something like, extroversion. Right. Now, moving on from Jung, we now look at the work of Alfred Adler. Now, Alfred Adler was also a student of Freud, but he branched out from Freud and went on to develop his own system, which he called individual psychology. And central to Adler's idea of human development was what he termed feelings of inferiority. So what Adler believed was that children naturally growing up, when a child is very, very young, right, and that child looks at others around them, right, who are older, they are sort of taken over by feelings of inferiority, and these feelings are what underlie the motivation to develop new skills or to grow, right? So basically, when you look around you, you're a child, you look around you, you see others who are more capable than you, and what that does is that, it basically produces feelings of inferiority in you, but these feelings of inferiority serve as the motivation to develop new skills and to grow, right? So this is basically what Adler's conception was, and he believed that, at the very core of personality was this desire for growth. So he also disagreed with Freud in, the overemphasis on sexual and aggressive drives, right? And he believed that the fundamental drive of human beings is the desire to grow, right? But he also believed that certain times these feelings of inferiority that are the motivation behind growth become what is called an inferiority complex. And what happens then is that the person is so heavily overcome by this sense of their own inferiority that rather than growing, right, they are constantly lying to themselves, right, in order to hide their inferiority, to conceal their inferiority. Now, what could be an example of this? An example of this could be that any individual who has what Adler terms an inferiority complex, or basically, these feelings of inferiority that are so overwhelming that they take away. So rather than providing motivation for growth, right, and for the development of skills, what they do is that they take away that motivation, right? So what a person then tends to do is that they tend to overcompensate. And let's suppose if they do have a success, they have some kind of success, they will flaunt it excessively because they are trying to hide or mask their inferiority complex, right? So such people tend to be more about appearances than about their own self. So they are more about flaunting whatever it is that they have rather than truly enjoying it and experiencing it, right? So this, according to Adler, is at the very core of personality. Then another thing that Adler laid out, which is extremely important, is, and which is something that has researchers have developed a renewed interest in this, is the idea of birth order. So Adler believed that whether you're a firstborn child or the second-born or the last-born, so this has a huge impact on your personality. So what he believed was that firstborns tend to usually be much more competitive and responsible, right? Whereas lastborns tend to be more rebellious. Now, his ideas have not always been supported by research, but there is renewed interest now in his ideas on birth order. But this is, again, it's something that's very relatable when you think about it yourself and you compare yourself to your siblings. You can see how there's a difference in terms of what the firstborn child is like versus what the secondborn child is like, and what the lastborn is like, right? So this definitely seems to make a lot of sense. So yeah, so this is all for the psychodynamic perspective. Now, if we look at certain limitations of the psychodynamic perspectives, first of all is that given psychology and how psychology is a scientific discipline, psychodynamic approaches have a very poor testability. Basically, what that means is that most ideas of the psychodynamic perspectives, for example, Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, you cannot test this, right? You cannot create very clear testable hypotheses out of something like this. So, what happens is that, because they are so sort of about theory, right, or about ideas, the whole psychodynamic theory is so much about different ideas, right? So it really has poor testability, and you cannot really create very clear hypotheses regarding all of these different areas that psychodynamic perspectives talk about. And therefore it's sort of marred by this particular limitation. So that's one limitation. If we talk about some others, what could those be? Another is that there is inadequate evidence. So for example, with Freud's idea of personality and the three-part structure of personality, you don't have a lot of evidence, or his psychosexual stages, for example, right? You don't have a lot of evidence, and mostly the evidence for all of psychodynamic perspectives come from, these people's interactions with mostly people who came to see them for therapy, right? So with their own clients. And that evidence is not always the best evidence, because sometimes, because you subscribe so strongly to any one particular theory, you tend to interpret all sorts of events in the light of that theory. So then that's not a very valid form of information that you have there, right? So, there's not always adequate evidence to support psychodynamic perspectives, just like we said that about, Adler's idea about birth order, that there isn't a lot of evidence that sort of shows that firstborns are a particular way versus lastborns are, some other way. So that definitely is one of the limitations regarding psychodynamic perspectives. Next, what we talk about are behaviorist perspectives. And when we talk about behaviorist perspectives, we mostly consider the work of B.F. Skinner. Because B.F. Skinner believed, when he talked about personality, he believed that personality is nothing but a cumulative form, or a combination, you can say, of response tendencies, right? And these response tendencies are tied to particular situations. Now, what does that mean? What that basically means is that people, through reinforcement, and you must know what reinforcement is because we've already covered this in the chapter on learning. So through reinforcement, right, they have learned to respond in a particular manner in a given situation. Right now, whenever that situation arises because of reinforcement, right now, whenever this particular situation arises, right, these people have learned through reinforcement to respond in a particular manner, right? And them learning to respond in this particular manner is what we call their response tendency, right? And it's tied to a particular situation, right? Let me show you an example of this. Now, let's suppose you are at a party, right? And you tell your friends jokes, right? Or, let's suppose they're even strangers and you start telling jokes. And there's a lot of laughter and attention and compliments that you get. So basically, your response, which is telling jokes, are met with this reinforcer, right? Now, what will that do? That will condition you to tell jokes at parties. So because you received this kind of reinforcement, it becomes more likely that next time there is this situation, which is that of a party, right? Your response will be to tell jokes because you have been conditioned such because of the reinforcement that you received when you did this at this one particular party, right? Now, telling jokes then becomes your response tendency, right? Which is tied to a particular situation, which is that of a party, right? So, according to B.F. Skinner, this is simply what personality is, that it is a combination of different response tendencies that are tied to particular situations, right? And B.F. Skinner believed that, research on human beings was not necessary, that you could, conduct research on animals. And that would be just as applicable on human beings because it was not the organisms that was important, right? The organism that was important, it was rather what was happening, the sort of reinforcement that they were receiving, and what was happening as a result of that reinforcement, that was important, right? So, animal research under the behavior school became something that became a lot more common, right? So this is, B.F. Skinner's idea of personality, that it is completely, so according to Skinner, personality is completely shaped by the reinforcement that you receive and is therefore completely controlled by external events, right? Then came along someone by the name of Albert Bandura, right? And he brought forth with him another way of looking at behaviorism. Now, Bandura put forth what is called social learning or social cognitive theory. And what Bandura does is that he moves away from, what is considered more of Skinner's pure behaviorism, and he talks about a more reciprocal determinism. What that basically means is that Bandura believed that behavior is not just influenced by the environment, as B.F. Skinner asserted, but rather behavior also influences the environment, right? So there is a bidirectional influence here, that you have the environment that is influencing behavior with the form of reinforcement, but then behavior can also influence the environment. Likewise, another thing that has an influence on behavior is your personal or cognitive factors, such as your expectations, your beliefs about, your own self. All of these will have an impact on behavior, right? And all of these will also have an impact on the environment as well. So basically, his model is more interactive in the sense that these three components, which is the first of these is behavior, the second of these is environment, and then it's also your personal cognitive factors. So whatever your thoughts or your feelings or expectations are, right? These are also going to play a part in what sort of behavior you perform, right? In the case of, for example, when we look at this case in which you're telling jokes, right? When you're telling jokes, you're expecting a particular response, right? So that falls under your cognitive factors, right? And that obviously has an impact on whether you're going to tell those jokes or not, right? And your behavior also impacts the environment. Let's suppose, you're behaving very aggressively towards someone, right? Towards, let's suppose, your parents. That is going to influence how they react to you as well, right? And that is going to become your environment, and that is again going to have an influence on your behavior, right? So it's a bidirectional influence between all three of these components, that your personal or cognitive factors, which make up your expectations, your beliefs, right? Your ideas about something that Bandura calls self-efficacy. Now, what exactly is self-efficacy? Now, very, very, because we don't sort of get into a lot of detail in terms of what self-efficacy is, but it's the belief that it's basically believing in one's abilities, right? So if your self-efficacy is low, right, even if, for example, let's suppose at a party you told these jokes and everyone laughed, but your self-efficacy is low, you don't really believe in yourself, you might not tell jokes at another party because you don't believe that you will have the same kind of response. So that will also have an influence on your behavior, and it's not just always the environment that has an influence. So this is basically what the behaviorist theory is about, and we'll look at certain limitations of the behaviorist theory as well. So the first of these limitations is that behaviorist theory is derived mostly with, this over reliance on animal research or overemphasis on animal research. And you have to ask yourself this, that how much of human personality can you really understand using animals, right? So there's this overemphasis or over reliance on animal research, right? Then obviously there is when Skinner is conceiving of human personality as just being a product of reinforcement, right? Then that view of human personality is extremely deterministic. By deterministic, what we mean is that it is completely controlled by external events, and nothing is in our hands, nothing is in a person's hands, right? And Skinner sort of talked about how free will is an illusion, right? So you're never really choosing, you're never really deciding anything. It's all controlled by external events. And this is a thought that not everyone may agree with, right? So this is another limitation of the theory. Then you also have that, in behaviorist perspectives, you never really have a whole coherent view of personality. Rather, you have a very fragmented view. You have, the view that it's accumulation or a combination of response tendencies. So you're never really looking at personality as a whole, but rather as fragmented bits that are sort of just coming together, right, in a combination. So these are some of the limitations of the behaviorist theory that we have.